and welcome to the Texas System of Care Cultural and Linguistic Competence Podcast. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the CLC, or Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist with Texas System of Care. This podcast is devoted towards how to work with specific populations within your local system of care community and ensure that you're providing services that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. This series is focused on working with youth who identify as LGBTQ+ and their families. For a further explanation of CLC terminology, including terms used in this podcast, we recommend checking out the ABCs of CLC webinar series. Today we're joined by Sarah Kapostasy, Clinical Services Director at Out Youth in Austin, Texas. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for coming and joining us today to talk about working with the LGBTQ+ population. So something that we were kind of chatting about a little bit earlier that I want to open up and start talking about, because in regards to working with youth or working with parents or working with anyone who identifies as a member of this community, a lot of folks get really worried and concerned about what words to use, what terminology to use, just how to talk to persons, how to refer to persons, to the point where it can create a lot of anxiety, and people who I've spoken to are almost fearful of engaging with this population at times, or learning more about how to work with this community. So can you just kind of speak to that, why there are so many different terms and how one can become comfortable using different terminology or continue learning, and just in general from your perspectives about the importance of proper words. So I know that's covering a lot, but if you can kind of dig into that, I think that that's something that a lot of people tend to think about and sometimes be concerned about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to get to talk about the work that I do. So I'm the clinical director of Out Youth. I'm a licensed professional counselor. So I primarily work with youth and young adults ages 12 to 23, although we're expanding our programming these days and have a program where we are working with adults. So to your question about language, I think, it depends on the person sitting in front of you and that particular population. So I would say for youth, one thing I found to be really effective is that they can teach me a little bit, right? And I think that's really empowering for them. So I work in this field. I am steeped in this field. I'm a part of this community. And I don't know all the words that kids are using these days. Like literally, by the time we release this podcast, there will probably be a few new terms out there that folks are using for their identities and how they feel themselves to authentically be. So if a kiddo uses a word in a session that I'm unfamiliar with, I ask them. I say, hey, can you break that down a little bit for me? That's a new term for me. Can you explain what that means to you and why that's important to you? And I think that youth find that really empowering, to be able to explain why that word means a lot to them and why it's important to their identity. I would say with adults, maybe you'd have a slightly different tact potentially. And I think it is, of course, as professionals, we want to be responsive and we want to stay up on the lingo as much as possible. And it's a fine line, right? Because we don't want our clients to feel like they have to teach us everything, because that can kind of get exhausting and be a burden on the client. And so I would say, especially for adults, that can be a little bit more challenging. At the same time, I think same thing applies. I think you can't fake it. If you don't know what somebody's talking about and you don't take the time to ask and dig into that with them, I think that can set up a barrier as well. So yeah, I think beyond that, though, there are certainly a lot of good lists out there, good resources. One we just used at a conference that I was involved with was the GLAAD Media Guide is actually a really excellent one. So as a colleague of mine put it, GLAAD is sort of the police for the media in terms of terms, and they have some really great resources about how to talk about the LGBT community in the media. But I think that that particular resource could also be incredibly valuable for practitioners. And they seem to keep that pretty up to date. It's available online. You can download it. So, just giving that a quick glance every once in a while to kind of have the basics down, that would be one thing I would recommend. And then beyond that, really just taking it client by client and, valuing what they're saying as an individual and, taking it from there.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And can you speak a little bit more to something that you brought up was, ask questions, but at the same time, don't just completely depend 100% on the person that you are working with to kind of lead you on this. Can you talk a little bit more about that balance and the difference between appropriate questions for the purpose of getting to know the unique individual in front of you and just kind of sitting back and waiting for your clients to explain everything to you type of a thing?
Yeah, so I think one example that comes to mind about this actually relates to the medical field and responsiveness. So my partner identifies as a trans man and has generally had pretty good experiences with medical care here in Austin, especially related to gender-specific care, so hormone replacement therapy and the like. However, had a hernia recently and, had to get that taken care of, and the provider was not knowledgeable at all about how my partner should prepare for therapy in that way, or for the surgery, I'm sorry. So, my partner ended up having to do all the research and had to call his doctor. And I would say there are resources out there, especially for medical providers. One we learned about this weekend, it's called Transline, and doctors and medical professionals can call or I think they have some online functionality as well where you can ask a question and somebody who's knowledgeable about trans health and even specializations within the medical field can get back to you. So I think that's an example of, seeking out resources when it's appropriate and doing a little bit of research on your own if you don't know, rather than putting that burden on your client or the patient themselves.
So in that case, is it kind of fair to say that, the knowledge or lack of knowledge that the doctor had at that moment in time, maybe they could have been proactive ahead of time, but if they weren't, and that's just kind of the situation, that's the boat that individual professional was in, then from there it comes a point of really having to do some work and, take that on and not leave the burden of investigating into what's best practice and what is evidence-based and what is going to work specifically well with this individual. That shouldn't be all on that person to figure out. And I think that even though that example is in the medical field, in behavioral health or in mental health, the same thing applies. Hopefully folks will be proactive about learning things and having some general awareness ahead of time before ever working with or knowingly working with a member of LGBTQIA community. Likely people may have worked with someone in the past and maybe have not known it. But if that's something that is, present in the room, then working with that client and taking on, the professional responsiveness that needs to go into play there. I think that's a really, really good example. Getting back a little bit to what you're talking about with language use and terminology, something else that I've heard from folks that can sometimes be, it seems to almost be a barrier to clinicians learning genuinely how to appropriately work with this population is just the perspective that it's just overwhelming. Like there's all these new words, and there's all these like new identities, there's all these new things, and how can I possibly keep up? And some sort of undertone in there that I hear is kind of the perception that not only are the words new, but the identities are new as well, and just kind of seem to be popping out from nowhere. And this is kind of like a perplexing thing for a lot of folks. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between having words, having labels, having a variety of words that maybe used to all be kind of bunched into like one category type of a thing, and why that's happening, and your perspectives on if that's a good thing, if that's a not so good thing, and just kind of frame that a little bit, give it some more context.
Sure, absolutely. And I think I'm going to start my response by talking a little bit about something we say to every single youth that enters the doors at Out Youth. So what we say to them is, you've come here today, you may come back 1,000 times, you may never come back again, but now you are part of our family. And our job is to love, acknowledge, and accept you for exactly who you are, however many times that might change. Now, some people might think, and this is nuanced here, like, well, then are you saying that these identities are a choice? And that's absolutely not what we're saying. But what I would invite our listeners to think about is, if you may be a little older, if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, think about, are you a different person than you were when you were 16? That's all we're saying, right? And yeah, I think there are a variety of ways that folks are identifying these days, particularly youth, and I think they're really leading the way on a lot of these things. But one thing to be clear about is that these identities have always existed forever. We're just, as language evolves, we're finding new language to describe what that means to us and what that authentic identity might be defined as. And I think, the variety of labels we have, I want to empathize. It can feel a little bit overwhelming. It feels overwhelming for me sometimes too, but I think more than anything that speaks to, I talk with my clients a lot about how sometimes labels can be really helpful and descriptive, and sometimes labels can be limiting, right? So as mental health professionals, I think about this a little bit with certain diagnoses that folks may have, right? It's the same kind of concept. And I think because we have a variety of words to describe identities these days, it just speaks to the fact that, sometimes labels don't quite fit or are limiting. So when we used to have fewer words to describe identities, people would claim them, but then they would say, but that's not quite right. That's not quite hitting what I'm feeling genuinely in my heart and my mind, identifies who I'm attracted to, and or what my gender identity might be. So I think that's what I would say in terms of, how this language has sort of developed and exploded over time. I would also say one thing I've seen, and that youth report to me, is that people being able to connect with each other, particularly on the internet and social media, that's a relatively new phenomenon. And I think it's allowed folks to feel less isolated and to find people who are like them and to collectively come up with words that, define who they are. And so I think that's a lovely thing. And I think it's really progress. Can it be confusing? Yes. Can it be messy? Sure. But if for a 17-year-old who has been incredibly depressed for the last 5 years because they felt alone and like nobody was like them and nobody could understand them, finds a label that works for them and that helps their mental health, then that's amazing. Like, that's what we're looking for, right? So that's what I would say just in terms of kind of identities, labels, and the like.
Yeah. And obviously, connections with others, strong human relationships, being a part of a community, being part of something bigger, that's a common need. Those are common sources of resilience and of positive health and wellness in general, including but not limited to mental health. So that's not different for any individual. Can you speak a little bit about kind of the uniqueness of the LGBTQIA community and what that community means to individuals? Mm-hmm. Again, it's a common component of everyone's life that's important, but it may look a little bit different or have some different meanings for this community.
Absolutely. And I think, what comes to mind first is that one of the best things I think that we do at Out Youth in particularly at our drop-in center, is we basically just quote unquote, give those kiddos a normal middle school, high school experience where they don't have to feel different, where they can just really come and be their authentic selves, and people are going to ask them their pronouns no matter what. They're not going to get misgendered. They're going to be able to explore, if it's their thing, emotional intimacy, romantic intimacy in a non-judgmental space. And, also have those social connections that are super important because, within the larger culture, or let's say as they enter their 8th grade classroom or, they're at their high school, they might not feel that same sense of just automatic comfort that folks with privilege of not having to think about their identities around sexual orientation and gender identity may take for granted. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other thing that I think about a lot, certainly related to cultural responsiveness and privilege and diversity within the LGBT community, is that, from my perspective, we are both and have been historically really well positioned to, for example, meet people and be connected socially with people of other races and ethnicities, for example, who happen to share maybe a similar sexual orientation or gender identity. And I think that's been really powerful. At the same time, I think we have a lot of tensions within our community. And just like any community, I think, we've certainly left behind folks. So, for example, we still have, Black trans women being murdered at significant rates. And I think the larger LGBT community struggled for a long time to both be trans-affirming, just generally, but also to kind of acknowledge that the racism that pervades our society also affects us. Even though we identify as a marginalized group as a whole, there's still marginalized groups within our marginalized groups. And so how do we acknowledge that history and be really honest about it? And how do we move forward? And I will say I'm really proud to work for the organization that I do. At the same time, we've had a lot of conversations about how do we better center racial justice in our work. Because what we were noticing is that some of the kids that came to our drop-in center, as lovely as that experience is that we provide, we were not seeing a lot of youth of color. And we think there's a lot of different reasons for that, and certain kind of structural barriers, for lack of a better term, that may contribute. At the same time, what can we do in terms of hiring staff members that better reflect the larger community? What can we do in terms of outreach? So one thing we've tried to do recently is expand our school-based services program. So we are going into schools that are typically under-resourced, Title I schools. We're partnering with communities and schools in Central Texas in large part to do this. And we're trying to reach kids who have a variety of cultural identities, racial ethnic identities, may have a different socioeconomic status than some of the kids that access our drop-in center, because we want to offer that sense of community to as many folks as we can. And we don't want, certain barriers to get in the way of that.
I hope you enjoyed today's CLC podcast. If you have any questions on how to bring CLC initiatives into your local system of care community, please feel free to email us at info@txsystemofcare.org.